World War II exploded our sense of isolation. At the same time, it reinforced our stereotypes about the outside world. Beyond our borders lurked a frightful, appalling place. For the most part, our contacts with it had been unpleasant. Wars took our men, industry took our riches, and left us little in return. For years, we believed in our own innocence. It was the carpetbagger, the outsider, who defiled us. Montana was a subject state of the East, wrote Joseph Kinsey Howard, expressing popular sentiment in 1943, piteously exploited. Historian K. Ross Toole expanded upon this theme when he observed, "This place, called Montana, has been psychically beaten, battered, and bruised. It has often been misgoverned, exploited, lied to, and lied about. It has been visited by awesome drought, withering poverty, and genuine suppression of civil rights, riots, and lynchings. It has been notable for legislative incompetence of the lowest order, corporate arrogance of the highest order, corruption, and cynicism. Certainly the history of copper and its effect on Montana lends credence to Toole's thesis. The copper industry has ridden a roller coaster of breathtaking highs and bottomless lows. On that wild ride, it has taken the legislature, the courts, the press, and the people with it. World War II changed all that."
It wasn't really until after World War II that the full import of Anaconda's global expansion became visible, really, in Montana. And of course, you have to add to that the fact that by that time, the mid-20th century, the old 19th century domination of things, a la Marcus Daly, was becoming more and more anachronistic. Finally, the changes became evident in the mid-1950s, especially with the retirement of old Cornelius Kelly, who had been, remarkably, one of Marcus Daly's lieutenants, who was still in control of the company in 1955. Once Cornelius Kelly retired, changes came quickly. The Anaconda broke its alliance of many years with the Montana Power Company. One reason for that surely must have been the Anaconda's venture into aluminum production in the mid-50s, which relied on the public power of Hungry Horse Dam, which the power company was obviously not particularly enthusiastic about. You could see it in the 1959 sale of the Anaconda newspapers to the Lee chain, which came only that recently in 1959. By the 1960s, the Anaconda seemed only a shadow of its former overwhelming self in Montana. By then, it was acting more like most Western mining and energy companies, lobbying, pushing its efforts actively, but not relying on such ancient techniques as owning newspapers and using brass-knuckle open methods. The 1970s, of course, brought the great changes. When the Allende government, Marxist government in Chile, nationalized Anaconda's mines, it drove the company to the verge of bankruptcy. Some thought that Anaconda might come back overwhelmingly to Montana, but in fact, the company began selling off some of its allied operations in Montana. It sold its lumber holdings to Champion International, closed its zinc plants, for instance. The speculation was that Anaconda would be absorbed by some sort of conglomerate corporation. When ARCO became that company in the later 70s, it was hoped that ARCO would recapitalize the old Anaconda smelters and refineries, etc. Instead, of course, we had from ARCO the tragic shutdowns of the deep mines, of the mills, the smelters, a process that finally came to an end, it would seem, in the summer of 1983. So we really came full cycle by 1983, from the tremendous booming rise of Anaconda in the 1880s to the great copper shutdowns of the 1980s. Unlike Utah and Arizona, which will remain major copper-producing states, this terribly depressed industry probably will not come back to any large extent in Montana in our lifetime.
It's easy to see that the demands of the rest of the nation and the world profoundly affect events even in the smallest community in Montana. It's also clear that we have profited from our own abuse. Clark C. Spence noted that Montanans from the beginning were material-minded. We've encouraged and promoted our own exploitation at every step of the way, from the era of fur trapping and gold mining to the days of open-range ranching and dryland farming.
Could it happen again? Right now, 4 industries challenge us to answer that question as we develop new policies for land use. Agriculture, energy, timber, and tourism rely on the land and its resources. Each has grown in a post-war environment of national and international interdependence. Our future rests in the policies we make for these industries today.
It's probably difficult to ever define anybody's image or what anyone thinks the image of themselves is. The one thing that's striking about agriculture is that it's the most fundamental enterprise to organize society. That is, the most earliest people's first organized effort in towns or in societies was to have settled agriculture. And yet American agriculture today, particularly Montana farmers who grow wheat in phenomenal amounts, are the largest consumers of the most advanced technology, the largest consumers of advancements in science, and in many ways the largest consumers in advanced management techniques of any other group in American society. In a real way, they are a kind of link with the past and with the present, and again with the future. Montana farmers, or farmers generally, play this role. They in a sense have their feet in both camps. It may be that that's why their image is always one of a sort of ephemeral character. That is, we can't pin them down. They are biologists, they're geneticists, they are farmers, and they're also businessmen. And they take advantage of all of those things that we normally associate with modern life, and yet they are the link from a time when most people are engaged in farming, a time when the nation was character and the nation's image, the nation's institutions, all reflected an agricultural base. In our time, they're that last link which tells us what some of those earliest and fundamental values were. And to that extent, we honor them not only for their productive capacity, but for the very fact that they are that link.
Large-scale farming and ranching and the growing world markets that accompany them have transformed our image of ourselves. The homestead farms of 160 and 320 acres no longer exist. For a family to make a living at farming nowadays, they need 2,000 or 3,000 acres. With farms and ranches that size, agriculture has become a commercial enterprise.
Well, I think we've seen the trend develop that by and large they have to be bigger. Which is unfortunate in a way, but it just seems to be that the margins are so thin that it takes a little more land, a few more cattle in order to make enough to live on, though you can also lose a little more that way too. I don't think the implications socially are as serious as they make out. I think that since, as we said before, agriculture has become much more technical. Those who stay in it are going to have to keep up with those techniques. And almost by definition, some of them demand a larger operation. Not all of them. And it can be that with even units the size they are now or smaller, if they use those techniques to improve production, the family farm can exist.
Beneath the surface of the land we use for wheat and livestock lie other resources. With uncertain prices for foreign oil, Montana's oil and coal look promising to energy companies. Equally important is our nation's commitment to achieve energy independence. Because we don't want to depend on foreign oil, the legislators and corporations are encouraging the development of energy resources within the United States. At one point, the federal government targeted Montana as an energy sacrifice zone. The policymakers knew we would give up something when they used the term sacrifice. One observer commented that it's just a desert anyway. Hell, strip it.
The sacrifice, there will be two sacrifices. The first will be the sacrifice of people, their rights as human beings to own things and so on. The second sacrifice will be agriculture, because contrary to what industry will tell you, agriculture and industry cannot coexist.
The assumption behind that is, first of all, it's critical to have a sacrifice area because we need the energy. I'm not sure that assumption is correct in the current energy glut. The other sort of stereotype behind that is that Montana is sort of this vast wasteland. There's large ranches, there's a few cowboys running around, some grizzly bears up in the park, and that nothing much is going to be lost to the nation if we dig it up. I think there are going to be some tremendous sacrifices both for the people in Montana and for the nation.
I've not heard the expression that Montana was an energy sacrifice zone, and I, along with many other Montanans, I would resent that comment, because I don't think Montana is a sacrifice zone for energy, for agriculture, for its timber products, or anything else. We Montanans care very dearly about our land, and when somebody styles it as a sacrifice zone, they're going to get a lot of resistance out of many Montanans, including myself.
What Montana would sacrifice is everything that people hold most precious. Her big sky, her open spaces, her air, her water, and her land.
There are also some very important social and economic disruptions as well, but I think because people have a very distorted view of who's here in Montana and what there is to sacrifice, that the debate isn't happening on any real intelligent level when you get the debate down to a phrase like national sacrifice area.
We have an abundant amount of energy here, but I think the record speaks pretty clearly that we have developed it carefully. I think that applies to coal mining. I think it applies to the oil and gas development, every form of energy. I think Montana has established, all of us in this state have chosen to establish strict environmental laws. And if anybody wants to develop anything in this state, they're going to have to comply with the kind of laws that we Montanans expect them to live by.
So I think that it's not just Montana that's going to be affected. It's going to be a very large region and perhaps even the nation as well.
Our business is our own business. It's not up to us to tell our neighbor what to do. But we say it's okay for you to swing your fist, but when it hits my nose, then I can do something about it.
The Second World War seemed far away until all the GIs came back home. The veterans returning nationwide had a tremendous impact on the timber industry in Montana. Across the country, families needed housing, building materials, and an explosive growth in communities and in every kind of industry led to increased demand for a variety of wood products. The boom lasted until inflation and interest rates caught up with it.
By the fact that after World War II ended, there became, it was the beginning of the population boom in Montana, And of course, it was also the beginning of a great deal of leisure time, as you remember, and the conflicting uses began to come to the forefront. That cyclic attitude or nature that really occurred was partly as a result of the conflicting uses that occurred within the Montana National Forest. In other words, the demands became very, very prevalent for other than just timber products. The recreation industry, the grazing interest began to rise. There was much greater demands for water. The wildlife interest became much more apparent. And because of some of these things, that volume of harvest, although it started out strong, has kind of turned that corner now and has dropped off from the peak of the late 60s and early 70s.
Well, I think they're a very responsible federal agency, probably one of the better ones that I have to do business with. They have a lot of competent people. Certainly the industry has some arguments with them, and we don't always see eye to eye. But basically, they do a pretty good job. They're an agency that's limited by congressional funding, and lots of times they're asked to do things and they're never given the money to do it with. And so we have a lot of sympathy with our friends in the Forest Service lots of times and what they're allowed to do.
However, since our inception, right after the turn of the century, the Forest Service has practiced multiple use. What 1960 did was give us a legal mandate, if you will, to be sure that we manage renewable surface resources in the best combination for the American people.
We've got to decide what we want to be in Montana. If we're going to have a healthy, robust timber industry, we must resolve some of our land use problems, such as our study programs for timber supply and so forth. Because it's the unreliability of the timber resource from federal lands which is our biggest problem. We have no opportunity to plan any longer until that is resolved. And we have plants that would like to modernize, like to expand, but they don't know if they're going to have the timber to utilize or not. And so we've got to resolve that problem as soon as possible so that we can get ahead and plan and decide what we want to be in Montana.
The concept of multiple use, serving many people and interests, becomes critical in light of Montana's third largest industry, tourism. Can extractive, resource-using enterprises coexist with tourism, an industry that requires resources to remain in their natural environments?
Tourism is one of the four basic industries in the state of Montana, or one of the four major basic industries in Montana. Agriculture, of course, is the major industry in Montana, and that's complemented by wood products, mining, and tourism. Now, tourism is a basic industry in that it brings new dollars into Montana. It does it in a unique way. We don't ship a product out and then have dollars come back in. What we do is we bring the tourist or the traveler in to enjoy the resource. They take pictures and leave footsteps, footprints, and dollars in our economy and leave. Now the question really comes down to is one of if we mine the state of Montana and we cut all of the timber, will the tourists still come? No. I suspect that would influence the tourism in a great way. But we have land use management right now in Montana, and it's developing land use management as pressures of development come. For example, we have national parks in Montana. Glacier and Yellowstone, premier crown jewels of the national park system of the whole United States. We have national wilderness areas that are set aside for, among other things, recreational uses. We have primitive areas that are set aside for the same kind of things. We have historic sites such as the Custer Battlefield or the Big Hole Battlefield in Montana that are set aside specifically for the purpose of tourism and cultural enrichment. So as we progress in developing the state of Montana. If we are wise in the way that we do it, we see that tourism is clearly a growth industry in the state. Over the last decade, we've seen about a 5% annual growth rate in the number of people who are coming to Montana. Now there's ups and downs in that whole thing, but the average is about 5% over the last decade. If we continue with those kinds of growth rates, clearly tourism will become equal to or rival agriculture as a basic industry. But the point is not who's first or who's second or who's third, but rather diversifying Montana's economy. This past year, with interest rates being as high as they were, 1982, we saw a slump in the wood products industry, particularly in western Montana. Western Montana was hit very hard with layoffs in the lumber mills and in actually out cutting timber in the forest. Well, how did the retail people who were in Missoula and Butte and Dillon and all those places, how did they survive that? Well, one way they survived it is that there were tourists there in the summer to bring business to those businesses, all right? And it's that diversity that's important. Once you put all your eggs in one basket, then you can suffer major economic swings. If you make your economy more, flatten it out, make it more horizontal, then you're less subject to those wild fluctuations in the economy. So can tourism coexist with extractive resources? Yes, it can. Is it important to do so? It's very important for the state of Montana and Montana's future to do so.
While our parks have not created the vast wealth of the copper mines, they have provided a unique kind of treasure. Natural wonders drew people to Montana throughout the late 1800s and the early 20th century. Railroads brought tourists to spas and hot springs. Horse-drawn buggies carried them through canyons and over ridges. With the development of a National Park Service, as well as the Montana Park Service, public attitudes and policies towards our natural treasures changed.
In Montana, as we evolved from the rural concept to a more urban area and valued our treasures more, we saw changes in preservation, in acquisition of land, in development for use by all kinds of people and for all uses. We saw the acquisition of small fishing access sites to the development of large state parks as the Lewis and Clark Caverns or Headwaters. We saw a connection between our two major national parks, the Yellowstone and the Glacier, as being the ends, as it is, between a trail system of parks for the people of the land to enjoy. That when they come to see the national parks in Montana, they are also rewarded with seeing some of our state treasures. In our park system, we see more and more a gradual trend towards the development of urban area parks. This has come about as citizens have had input into the selection of the state parks. We have Giant Springs has been in existence for a long time, just outside of Great Falls, as a finely developed and landscaped area. Lake Elmo in Billings has just recently been acquired. Down west of Helena is the Spring Meadow State Park, which was just recently acquired. So more and more there will be urban areas. There's a variety of uses in the park system, from the fishing. We have areas open for hunting. We have picnic areas, camping. It's all season park system. Snowmobiling, cross-country skiing. We have areas for equestrian trails, hiking, nature study. Anything that the recreating public can enjoy outdoors can be done in the state park system.
We are just now beginning to recognize the appeal Montana has for outsiders. Perhaps the attraction lies in our quality of being the most western of western states, as Clark C. Spence described us. Or perhaps K. Ross Toole was correct when he noted that when land and space become scarce, they become precious. He wrote, "Montana has been graced with an abundance of that vanishing commodity. It cannot yet, if ever, be translated into dollars." Whatever the explanation, Montana will continue to attract outsiders for the resources to be exploited and for the resources to be enjoyed. Meanwhile, we in Montana will continue to look to the rest of the world more and more. And it watches us to see if we can preserve our most precious commodities: land, air, water, even the sky itself.